Well, thanks very much to Rosanna for inviting me to chair this evening's discussion, and to Pete Salmons, the director of the Institute here. Rosanna's already introduced the speakers. Just to say a little bit about how the discussion's going to work. So we're going to have brief introductions from each of the speakers in turn, going in the order in which Rosanna introduced them, so Paula, then David, then Linda. After which we're going to have, if they don't go on too much, a little bit of a discussion from the front, pursuing some of the issues that they raise, and issues that I've been thinking about or which come into my mind in the course of listening to them. The idea is that preliminary part of the proceedings lasts somewhere around half an hour, leaving then plenty of time, because I think that the timing, if I'm correct, is for us to end at 7:30. Is that right, Pete, Rosanna? 7:30. Okay. So that should then leave plenty of time for discussion and questions that you want to raise, and a bit of a to and fro with the panel. When we get to the question time, you will need to use the roving microphone. I don't know who it is who's roving with it, but someone will be roving with a microphone, partly for the purposes of recording the discussion, because it's being both filmed and recorded. Okay? All right then, so without further ado, as they say, Paula.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I hope we're going to have an interactive discussion, and hopefully my few words are going to be helping this sort of interaction. Well, natural hazards, as you know, there are a lot of them, whether it's earthquake, floods, landslide, fires, drought, are creating a number of human and economic losses. Every year, around 200 million people's lives are disrupted because of disasters. If you look at Haiti, and we're going to hear more about it, 360,000 people died. If we look at the earthquake in Chile in 2010, $30 billion lost, 16% of the GDP. If we look at the Eastern Great Japan earthquake, we're talking about $318 billion. Australia, the floods in 2010, $10 billion. And yet, the overall discussion is, why do we still focusing very much on preparedness and response, and we do not try to embrace more the disaster risk reduction component? When we're looking at numbers, we realize that we do not have a systematic way of disaggregating sex in terms of data of human losses. However, there are evidence that are clearly suggesting the fact that women are typically more at risk when a disaster occurs. This has been definitely the case in the ocean tsunami, where in fact women were far more touched by disaster. The same thing was proven in Bangladesh in 1991 with the cyclones, where out of the 120,000 victims, the highest number were women. And of course, we got studies that have been done by WHO and CRED, for instance, where they've been looking at India 2005, 2006, and they realized again that in the context of women, older people, and children, there was a higher risk of losing their life in the context of the tsunami. Why? Because many of these people cannot swim. Basically, there are a number of cultural norms that are creating some barriers in order to be less vulnerable to disasters. If we are looking internationally speaking what is happening in terms of framework that are going to guide us in order to reduce the risk and embrace the gender component, we realize that probably the strongest example is the Yogo Framework for Action. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Yogo Framework for Action that was adopted in Kobe in Japan in 2005. There was a big conference, world conference immediately after the tsunami. And in the framework, it is clearly indicated that gender considerations needs to be included in all the policy, planning, education, early warning, and information sharing. So there we got a strong basis in order to start proceeding with the work. However, if we are looking since 2005, what countries have been doing in order to address this component highlighted in the Yogo Framework for Action, what we realized is that it's not quite happening how it should. While most of the countries have got legislation, policy, and institution in place to promote gender equality in terms of employment and health and education, progress in order to incorporate gender in disaster risk reduction has been much, much slower. There are very few risk assessments where the gender component has been taken into consideration, where the vulnerability has been assessed in terms of women needs and cultural consideration. And if we're looking at the report that have been provided by the different countries, we realize that only 20% of them have been indicating in 2009 that they were embracing the gender and disaster risk reduction component. In 2011, this is slightly increased to 26%. By looking more into this sort of reports, what we realize, though, is that the reports or the activities are mainly focusing on the response phase, which per se, of course, in practical terms is extremely important, but is not challenging enough these cultural norms in terms of reducing the risk, in terms of training, in terms of risk assessment, to really lower the existing vulnerability in the context of disasters. And before my 5 minutes are over, I would like to also put forward another aspect that has emerged in the analysis of the Yogo Framework for Action in its midterm review. And what has emerged is that there is very often an application of the word vulnerable associated with the women. And in fact, this association per se is going to cut them out from the discussion, active discussion and decision making of the process, where in fact you have decision makers that sit around the table in order to discuss how to help the vulnerable. What we need to ensure is that women are going to be an active part in the discussion around the table. And this is a way in which we are going to be able to reduce vulnerability of women.
Okay, thanks very much.
Good evening. Firstly, I'd like to apologize for the state of my voice, which influenza has perhaps more than decimated. If there are any of my students in the audience, I ask you not to cheer if my voice should fade away totally. I suppose I'm on this panel because of two possible qualifications. The first being that I've been studying disasters as an academic for 32 years. That really puts me in relation to disaster studies as Marks and Spencer stands in relation to underwear. In other words, useful but not indispensable. The other qualification I have is that I happen to have been born on International Women's Day 60 years, 16 and a half hours ago, about 5 kilometers from here, but whether that really qualifies me is another matter. However, this is something that really came to light in 1982. I'm not suggesting that the first academic studies of the position of women and girls in disaster stem from 1982. Indeed, if you look at the evacuation of the Titanic after it had hit the iceberg, you'll find that women and girls were heavily discriminated against. However, John Rivers of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, an epidemiologist, wrote a seminal paper in the journal Disasters in 1982 called Women and Children Last, an essay on sex discriminations. You didn't say gender in those days. There wasn't a sense of a distinction between physical difference and social or cultural difference. And this really started off a process. There are now books, there is a corpus of studies, field studies, theoretical studies on the position of women and girls in disaster. I've made a very small contribution to that in as much as we studied the Aquila earthquake of 2009 in Italy, and we found that there was a much larger death toll among women than among men, particularly in certain age groups and especially over the age of 70. You might say, well, there are probably demographic reasons. Over 70, there are more women alive. But of course, the first thing we did was to correct for that, and we still found a much higher death toll among women than men. So we did three things then. Firstly, we sought an explanation of that. Secondly, we looked at the context of it in our field study area of central Italy. And thirdly, we looked at the literature worldwide. Referring to the literature, the first thing we found was that most researchers on earthquakes don't bother to distinguish between males and females. They're just people. However, where they do, massive differences appear in the vulnerability of males and females. I'm referring here particularly to work done in China, Taiwan, Pakistan, and regarding tsunamis, Sri Lanka. It's somewhat more difficult to say why this is. In instances, it is a cultural problem. Purda in Pakistan, for example, meant that in the 2005 earthquake, women were confined in buildings that collapsed and men weren't. It was suggested in Russia that women tried much harder to save their offspring than men did. We didn't find that, by the way, in Aquila. All we found in the case of Aquila is that women tended to regard buildings more as a sense of place of refuge than men did. And when the buildings collapsed, of course, women were the primary victims. But besides that, we also found that women were heavily discriminated against after the earthquake in terms of employment, and that they suffered a double burden in statistical percentage terms with respect to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and all the bad things that happen after an earthquake. So the psychological impact of the Aquila earthquake, according to our fairly detailed house-to-house studies, was definitely far, far greater among women than among men. Men had different kinds of safety valves, but several of them, particularly substance abuse and domestic violence, of course, worsened the position of the women who were there, who had the double burden of coping with greater unemployment and coping with keeping the family on the rails, especially if the male member of the household, assuming that there was a male member of the household, was not doing that adequately. So this is a small example, but I think you'll find that if you look at the literature, there is considerable evidence that the position of women is worse than that of men, and girls as well. I can recall visiting a village in Bangladesh, for example, where there wasn't enough food and the household would eat in the order of men, boys, women and girls, which meant that very small female children suffered seriously from malnutrition. There are questions of fairness in this, and it is not so much a question of protecting women in many instances. Well, perhaps it is from violence. It's more a question of empowering women, and also that decision-making and policy and politics and many other things are also seen from the point of view of women, and that it is not automatically assumed that the point of view is that expressed by middle-aged men like yours truly. I'm sorry, do I mean old men? Anyway, regardless, those of us over a certain age who are male. Essentially, the paternalistic approach to all of this has failed, and it's failed very miserably. What is worrying in a place like Europe is that the position of women is deteriorating according to the latest statistics. That is to say, rather than advancing their position in parliaments, assemblies, captains of industry, and leading positions of responsibility, that in fact is not improving in the recession. It is, if anything, going backwards. Well, I think we need to do something about that, because there are fundamental questions of fairness, equity, and also it seems basically ridiculous to waste half of human talent in any way. Thank you.
Thanks.
So thanks very much for the invitation to speak. When I started thinking about what I could say to enhance the conversation, I realised that I could talk a lot about how difficult it is to plan reconstruction after a disaster, how the disaster affected the women and the girls that we worked with, but actually it's difficult for me to say how the disaster affected the women and the girls that we worked with relative to their male counterparts. So what I thought I'd do in my 5 minutes was just to give a really brief soundbite summary of what happened in Haiti, which is where our project is, to try and kind of bring the realities of disaster to life and help everyone to visualize what it's like and to spark the debate. So I coordinate what is primarily a reconstruction planning project for one girls' school site in Port-au-Prince. So the site is on the north part of this green kind of triangle, and it serves the community that are basically all around, particularly Fort National to the north. And so most of my knowledge about what their life is like since the disaster is as a result of planning what's going to go there in the future. So as Paula has already said, a disaster doesn't happen because of an earthquake or because of a tsunami. It happens because of extreme vulnerability. So some stats about Haiti before the disaster: already extremely high child and childbirth mortality. According to Women's Rights NGO, there's really disparate stats on what Haiti was like beforehand, but one set says nearly 80% of Haitians lived in extreme poverty, more than half suffered from malnutrition. Poverty and hunger rates were even higher in cities, especially Port-au-Prince, where as many as 90% of people live in poverty. Unemployment was at 70%, while tens of thousands of people died each year from preventable illnesses related to the lack of clean water, and obviously this has just got worse since the disaster with the advent of cholera. Cities were incredibly cramped, densely populated. There were no enforced building codes, which means that people built their own houses without very many skills. They built them to resist hurricanes, maybe, if they were lucky, but certainly not earthquakes. And where there were buildings built by professionals, as in the case of the school that we're trying to reconstruct, because there are no enforced codes, because no one's breathing down your neck and saying, are you putting in all the rebar you're supposed to put in? They're not built properly, and so they caused huge damage. And okay, before sketching a picture of the damage done by an earthquake in such a vulnerable context, I'll just make two comments about the different circumstances of women relative to men. Traditionally, women do the majority of low-paid work in Haiti, and that's still the case. They're the people that you see buying and selling vegetables. They might make 25 cents a day. Money goes up, but generally they're selling very, very low-cost items. They were working in the factories and sweatshops, and they were doing domestic service. While men tend to be slightly more educated, they tend to have better paid jobs. They're in security, they do transport, they have second-hand shops. They mightn't be in shops, they're along the streets. They have larger stores, they do the lottery stands. So already there's a difference in the economic means of both sexes, and also from the gender side of things, women are responsible for pretty much all household tasks. It's quite a traditional place in that respect. They're the carers of children, the elderly, more so now the disabled, and therefore the collapse of a large section of industry will inevitably affect both sexes differently. And secondly, worth mentioning that given the extreme inequality and widespread poverty, security was already a problem before the disaster for many reasons. The site that we work on has 24/7 armed guards, so little girls roll up to school and they're met with two men with massive guns. And so in that context, gender-based violence was already an issue before the disaster. So when the disaster hits, the stats are pretty horrific. As was already mentioned, between 200,000 and 316,000, they're the stats that I have, dead. 300,000 people injured, between 1.5 million people homeless. The government of Haiti estimates that 250,000 houses were lost, 30,000 commercial buildings, everything you could possibly imagine, churches, any lifelines, hospitals, schools, any other public services gone. And yet, as has already been mentioned, I could find very little data on the effect of women as opposed to men, on how many women died versus men, etc. So the impact of this destruction in such a concentrated area is enormous and complex, and I'm not going to try and enumerate it. I'm just going to make 2 points about the way that I'm aware, at least, that this kind of destruction has affected women, as opposed to men, and girls as opposed to boys. Firstly, women, as I've mentioned, are affected differently by the economic blow, and secondly, women are, it's worth mentioning, more physically vulnerable, and because this has been a big topic since the disaster. The school that we work in, people aren't able to pay their school fees anymore. Most of the education system in Haiti is private, because the government doesn't really do a very good job of providing education. So we've seen basically a drop in people's ability to pay their fees from about 85% of parents to 50%. Women who lost husbands, the main breadwinner, the more able breadwinner in the family, suffered particularly. Something that I haven't directly witnessed but is well documented, differing needs of women rebuilding their businesses. So because they're responsible for childcare, because they're responsible for caring for elderly, for the extended disabled family, they're going to have very different obstacles in getting back into work for those reasons. And finally, the hunger issue, malnutrition issue is something that we've noted as well. There's been a growing instance of families that are completely dependent on school for food. And the last statistic that I have from last year is that a quarter of the girls that go to our school rely on the school for their main meal of the day. Okay, and the second point, physical vulnerability. I'm just going to quote two people because I'm not really an expert on this, and I don't want to overemphasize it relative to the general kind of structural disadvantage to women in Haiti, but it is worth mentioning that physically women have fared very badly by not having a safe, stable place to live, by not having protection, by not having lighting. So the US Social Science Research Council makes the point that in food rights, women have, it's a survival of the fittest thing. There have been food rights in Haiti, and women haven't fared so well for obvious reasons. But more strikingly, I'm going to quote, who am I going to quote? The UN Universal Periodic Review. This is a collection of grassroots Haitian organizations and NGOs submitted a paper saying that although official statistics are lacking, research demonstrates that after disasters and conflicts, women and children living in IDP camps, as internally displaced people camps, are especially vulnerable to sexual violence and rape. In Haiti, we have statistics from University of Michigan saying that 3% of all people have been sexually assaulted in the first 5 months after the disaster. Only one of those people was male. And likewise, Médecins Sans Frontières, SOFA, other NGOs report obscene numbers of cases of sexual violence. So some closing points. Basically, there are differences in the way that men and women and boys and girls interact and are treated by society, and as a result, particularly in terms of blows to livelihoods, a disaster is going to impact upon them differently. And if you don't include the views of all the needs groups, of all the groups of the people that you're trying to serve in a disaster recovery plan, you can't expect to develop a strategy that meets everyone's needs. And that was a big failure after Haiti when the post-disaster needs assessment was first carried out. Gender and women's issues were pretty much not mentioned except for in one section as a cross-cutting issue in the national needs assessment. And so there was a response, there was a shadow report. But that said, the people that we work with are doing phenomenal work. They run swathes of schools. They run a quarter of they teach a quarter of the primary school teachers in Haiti how to be teachers. They run medical centres. They're extremely able. Likewise, their students are extremely driven. They want to be change makers, and it's just a matter of letting their voices be heard and getting them involved in the plan for recovery.
Thanks. Okay, thanks very much to all our speakers for kicking us off very well. I'm sure that everybody's got questions that they're starting to think about in their minds and issues they'd like to raise, and questions they might like to put to individual speakers, or more they'd like to hear about either the work on the ground or the research work or the policy work that's being done. Just to start things off, though, I've got a couple of more overarching areas just to ask about, just for a few minutes before we go out to the floor. The first I thought it might be useful to look at is what assessment you're making of the relationship between evidence and policy making. So obviously we now live in an age where everybody is very into evidence-based policy making. And considers knowledge generated through research processes and evidence as being the best starting point for policy. One of the messages that seemed to come out, though, of what you were saying and also what you were saying, that there's a lot of things that we don't know, that there appears to be high levels of uncertainty and lack of clarity. So questions are being asked, but answers haven't been found, or if they have been found, they're particular to particular situations and a point of the ability to generalise about how to understand where gender fits into the context of disaster has not quite been reached. Now, maybe I'm wrong, maybe that's misinterpreting what you said, but if there's any truth in that, then it does seem to me to be potentially at odds, or interesting issues are raised by uncertainty about what we know set against a policy context which appears to be driven by a great deal of clarity, that gender matters, we must set things up in relation to particular ideas about gender. In other words, has the cart, in some sense, gone before the horse is what I'm asking. Another way of putting it is perhaps it might be useful to comment on exactly what you mean when you say gender should be taken into account in risk assessment. Well, if we don't know what we mean by the concept or exactly what it is we're talking about, how could you actually possibly take it into account? So could you first of all each comment on that area?
Absolutely. Okay. I think I will start. You are absolutely right in mentioning the gap in terms of evidence. Evidence is a challenge when we are looking specifically in terms of gender and disaster risk reduction, but evidence is a challenge anyway in looking at disasters. If we think about the struggle in order to be able to put data and information together on the human and economic losses in terms of disaster, we can imagine how difficult it is to be zooming into the dimension of gender and disaster risk reduction. The willingness of country to gather information and to report to the UN in terms of what they've been achieved and what are their challenges in addressing the reduction of risk has been a process, let's call it a process, that is still very much ongoing. And what has been interesting since the adoption of the Hyogo Framework for Action in 2005 is that gradually we see more country reporting and also more country being more specific in terms of the numbers. And as just pointed out, it's only in 2009, 2011 that we start seeing the fact that the gender component should be there in terms of the activities, but in fact it's not happening. So where do we start? We start from the showcase, where there have been some initiatives that have been worked. We collect the experience, we share the experience, and we try to trigger the interest in order to scale up this sort of projects and initiatives. The other point that it was just mentioned in terms of knowing what it means risk assessment and gender risk assessment. Now, I'm not sure what is your background or what sort of knowledge you have in the context of risk, but I would be inclined to ask you, do you know what risk is? So, in fact, the whole idea of looking at risk assessment and gender risk assessment requires a political dimension in which there is an adoption and an engagement in terms of a number of measures that needs to be undertaken. Then you have to start developing the guidelines on how you're going to be doing this work, what it really means. You have to educate people in order to see how things can be done, assess what it works, what it doesn't work, and at the same time trying to see the success story and building it up institutionally speaking. So certainly these are all challenges in order to be able to say, yes, as per today, based on the experience of Haiti and other countries, we can say that risk assessment should be gender-based, and therefore, as per tomorrow, is going to happen. It really is a process. It requires time. It requires sharing of experiences and data.
I was wondering, could you just, perhaps give us some examples or pull it down to earth a bit? So say, for example, when you say we need to educate people, yes. Well, educate them about what? What do you mean by educating people?
Indeed. I can give you a very practical example that relates to gender and disaster risk reduction, talking about gender risk assessment. First complexity, to know what it means to assess the risk. You have to start from the local level. And you have to look, what are your vulnerabilities? Where is your house located? Is it located in an area that is going to be flooded? How is your building built? Is it going to be an earthquake that is going to make the building collapse in this case? And then you look at the gender component. Typically, if you are in a certain part of the world and you know that there are going to be floods, as it was the case in Djibouti where I lived, are women going to be able to swim or not? If they do not, this needs to be taken into consideration in terms of the vulnerability assessment. This is the way in which it's going to be able to indicate that there is an action that needs to be taken. After that,
which would be what, swimming lessons?
Of course, swimming being one of them. After that, once you got something that you can see it works in terms of risk assessment, you have to see how you can inform the rest of the people. And this is something that requires some efforts, coordination, engagement from all points of view. The experience in terms of UNISDR and the work that we do, for instance, is that based on what has happened in the Caribbean in terms of issues related to floods, there's been a training developed, a training package that was looking at risk assessment in the community. This training was proven to be particularly successful. So what has happened, that we've been joining forces together with a number of other UN agencies and NGOs. We developed a training package, and this has been delivered in 102 countries to date. So somehow we are spreading something that we feel like is working. But as I keep saying, it is work in progress.
David, what's your thoughts?
Well, if you if you type into a search engine, excuse me, voice is getting even worse. If you type into an academic search engine, gender and disasters, what comes out? Well, what you'll find is an increasing, accelerating rate of publication of material. You'll find that there are perhaps a dozen key researchers, but there are plenty of others who have dabbled in this. And you'll find that the researchers come either from universities or from NGOs. But you'll also find that gradually we're starting to accumulate the evidence base. The problem with it is, of course, that it will be rather different for Sweden and Ethiopia. However, if we take the case of Ethiopia, there has been a fairly abundant amount of research on the vulnerability of women, the strengths of women, and the potential of women. So not all negative, and often with an applied dimension, namely how to safeguard and improve the position of women. So the research is being done, and I think if someone is kind enough to do periodic summaries, we've already had at least one book published on the topic, but if we do get periodic summaries of it, then we'll gradually arrive at a position where we have an evidence base on which we can go forward with policy design. I think, if anything, we have to worry about disinterest or lack of interest on the part of governments. If governments are mainly composed of men who see it from a male perspective and don't see any problem or any reason for safeguarding women or developing their potential, then we have serious problems. Instead, if governments are a bit more open about this and understand that problem, then things will change. So the research also needs not merely to document the situation, but also to do so in such a way that it will convince governments. Thank you.
Do you want to comment, Nelly?
I wouldn't have a huge amount to add. The only point to make is that if you want any kind of education program to be effective, it's definitely going to have to include the people that do education in that country. And it's great, having a strategy, but it needs to be well connected to the people that administer at local level.
Okay. The other area I just wanted to throw out, which the panel may want to completely ignore or may want to comment on, is to do with the concept gender and its applicability to the context that we're talking about. And I mean, as a concept, its history really lies in Western feminism more than anything else. and a distinction between sex as biological difference between men and women, and the idea instead that difference is socially constructed, as 1960s and 1970s feminists would have it. An idea which has obviously then been very influential in the development of politics and thinking in Western countries. One question I suppose I've got is whether there is any sense in which there is a problem with using a concept which has that kind of history, and also some might argue has brought with it in the terms of the way it's then worked itself out in Western societies. Is there any problem with simply applying that concept, taking it off the peg, and using it to understand situations in completely other contexts and in developing world contexts? The reason why I asked this question is thinking about what you had to say about Haiti, or what other people have had to say about the aftermath of some of these most terrible, terrible situations. It doesn't strike me as if the guys are exactly having a fantastic time, right? You've got phenomenally poverty-stricken cultures and societies where things are just terrible for everybody. So it's not like the guys whose wives and families die stuck in the houses are advantaged, is it, from this situation? There are no winners. And one of the things that strikes me is whether the utilisation of the concept gender and this idea of creating a situation, even if in some sense it may be true, well, there's relative levels of disadvantage. So obviously it's worse to be dead than still alive, but to be alive having lost your entire family is hardly brilliant. Whether there is any risk of an unintended consequence at all of creating an artificial level of polarisation between the interests of men and the interests of women in articulating the view that gender should be a driver for how we understand these situations. So really that's just a question which you may want to completely ignore. Do you want to say anything on that? Okay.
I once had dinner in Tehran with a lady factory owner, industrialist, and naturally the conversation got around to gender and disasters and gender in society. I think I'm right in saying that juridically in Iran, a woman's life is worth half as much as a man's life. There is a distinguished Iranian academic in the audience, and I'm sure she'll put me right if I blunder horribly. But I think that if one were to go out and knock down a pedestrian and kill same, the compensation required would be double for a man with respect to a woman. So we were discussing all of this, and the late industrialist opined the suggestion that the worst enemy of women in Iran are women in Iran. In other words, that they were not pushing hard enough for change, especially given that 60% of university graduates in Iran are female. This, however, I think was an understandable expression of frustration, but there are, of course, consequences if one does push. I can recall in the same city being at a round table of ladies in the disaster management field talking about females and disaster management. I dare not say feminism in the context that it was in, but there was a palpable air of excitement about the whole idea and a palpable desire of the women present there to be more involved and to have more responsibility and do more. In the end, the Deputy Director of Emergency Management for the city of Tehran, which is an enormous city with enormous risks, is female. But you get the strongest impression there's a glass ceiling there, and it will never be a female director under present circumstances. So on the one hand, there are women, especially the more educated they are, in a circumstance like that, who would like to see considerable change, but they also fully understand the consequences of pushing for it, which can be very, very distressing indeed. If you look at the work of the morality police, for example, and what they would do, there's some of the violence meted out not merely by men, but by women in the police against citizens, and of course I mean female citizens. So I think there are probably other cases in the world. I'm wondering whether in Indonesia there might be examples, for example, or the Philippines, where there are plenty of women who want positive change, who are ready to assume the responsibilities that go with it, but who understand the risks involved with trying to assume it or trying to take that agenda forward.
Okay. Want to comment at all, or don't have to?
Well, I will take the occasion to point out one aspect that you mentioned that is extremely important, because in looking at gender and disaster risk reduction, you mentioned the sustainable development, and that is very relevant. When we're looking at the topic of reducing risk of disasters and including gender consideration into it, we're looking at a sustainable development issue. With the numbers that I just gave at the beginning of my speech in terms of economic and human losses, it's clear that if we do not reduce vulnerability, we're going to jeopardize our own sustainability. So action needs to be taken. If we look at the Sustainable Development Agenda, we also clearly see the cultural norms and expectation of society in certain parts of the world are actually creating a disadvantage in terms of the women, in terms of access to education, in terms of opportunity to be informed, in terms of opportunity to be able to take decision and move forward the decision with action. So this is something that is very much at the core of the Sustainable Development Agenda and that needs to be addressed in order to be able to reduce vulnerability to disasters.
Since you mentioned it, let me just ask you about this a little bit more then, and see if again you could just specify a bit more what you mean. So in one of the key messages from the International Day for Disaster Reduction in October 12, and the key messages that your organisation put out in relation to that, one of them was that's to say women's experience, knowledge and expertise are critical to climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction strategies and processes. So presumably what you're suggesting there is a particular experience, knowledge and expertise that women have that men don't, which needs to be drawn on. I mean, what kind of thing are you talking about? What do you mean when you say that?
Yes, well, I will start by actually quoting an African saying that says the following. If you educate a man, you educate an individual. If you educate a woman, you educate a family. So if we translate this saying into a way of training, giving opportunity to women to access community and to work with the community, you realize that the impact and the role that women can have in order to address climate change adaptation, meaning in terms of action, reducing vulnerability to disasters, is extremely relevant. It's like a source of potential that is not being used by the society in order to reduce vulnerability.
But you mean because they're mothers? So I mean that presumably is the meaning of this proverb. If you educate a woman, you educate the family.
Well, certainly the
because
fact
they have children, that's why they're...
It's not necessarily because they got children, but because they stay with children. In a majority of the society, in developing countries, you will see that the role of the women is still very much related to being at home together with their children. So the possibility for these women to know what is going to happen in terms of a sirens and the early warning and making sure that they will not only look at their own security, but also the security of the children, per se, is something extremely relevant. At the moment, it's not happening.
Okay. Did you want to...
Just to emphasise the fact that women necessarily are in a particular kind of culture, in a particular set of gender norms, of necessity, you have a different experience by virtue of being of a different sex. So the issue isn't that you know things intuitively because you are a woman, it's just because society treats you a certain way, therefore you have this experience that needs to be brought to the discussion of how do we go about protecting ourselves as a collective when something terrible happens.
Okay.